Welcome to our 177th episode of the Climate Now podcast, and what will be the final episode of what we are calling our first season. I'm James Lawler. The implication, which I hope is not lost on anyone, and so I'll state it outright, is that there will be a season 2, but that needs to wait a few months. We have quite a few episodes that we've already recorded, and lots of ideas for how we can improve our show. These will marinate, and sometime in 2025 we'll come back better than ever. So for our 177th final episode for Season 1, we have a bit of a treat for you. In celebration of our first season, Emma Crow-Willard, our producer, and I are going to talk about the last 3.5 years and what we've learned. And then in the second half of the episode, you will hear a live debate from Climate Week NYC about the speed of the energy transition. The debate will feature my Climate News Weekly co-host, Dina Cappiello, who is also Chief Communications and Marketing Officer at RMI, and the debaters, Kingsmill Bond, who is Senior Principal in the Strategy Team at RMI, who takes the side of the energy transition is going faster than we think, and Denman, who is Head of the Utilities and Renewables Practice in the Americas and partner at Bain and Company. You'll hear that real-time debate shortly. It was a great conversation. First, our recap. Climate Now launched in May of 2021 with the goal of getting under the hood of the energy transition, going deeper than we saw other outlets going to understand the technologies and the pathways to achieve the massive emissions reductions that we need, transition our energy system, and remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We wanted to build a channel that would provide valuable insight for policymakers, for journalists, educators, for investors, business leaders, and those looking to get more involved in advancing climate solutions. From our very first episode with MIT's Carrie Emanuel to our final episode today, we've interviewed experts across a wide range of climate topics, from energy efficiency to adaptation, to public-private finance, and to challenges with and solutions to electrifying our cars and our homes. The Climate Now podcast has received countless emails from our listeners and suggestions of speakers, questions about episodes, and appreciation for the valuable insights that our show has provided. Climate Now has also branched out to produce events across the country with partners including Department of Energy and the Livermore Lab Foundation, and have worked with a fantastic group of writers, editors, producers, and researchers who've made our podcast possible. So the Climate Now podcast has been a team effort on the part of a number of people, foremost among whom is Emma Crow-Willard, our producer. Emma's here.
Hello. Thanks for having me on, James.
So we've done 177 of these episodes together. You and I have worked on every single one together. Like, what have you learned about the energy transition and climate sort of science and where we are over the course of season 1?
I was kind of reflecting on what did I believe and what did I know when I first came into Climate Now.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, obviously I already knew a lot about climate and like the energy transition, but I knew way less about carbon management, carbon capture and storage, carbon dioxide removal. When we first started out, we sat down with Ozak, one of our video hosts, and we were like, what do we want to focus on? Both you and Ozak were really interested in direct air capture and I think carbon capture. And so that's where we ended up starting. And that ended up leading us to a whole bunch of different projects in that whole realm and really doing hardcore deep dives down into that particular type of climate technology.
Yeah.
And do you feel like you had a couple most memorable episodes?
Yeah, I think some of the more memorable ones, I would have to say, I don't know.
It's hard because there were so many.
Yeah,
and there was a lot of just great conversations and really deep dives. I think the debate ones for me are often really memorable.
Yeah.
Like the nuclear debate, in particular, because you get such different viewpoints.
Right.
And,
or SRM.
The SRM debate, exactly. Yeah, it just shows how kind of complex and complicated all of these decisions are.
Yeah. Indeed.
In terms of big key takeaways, there's a lot of new innovation going on in this space, and that's exciting and makes it kind of optimistic. And so it's like, how will all of this maybe accelerate our climate solutions.
And we have the person who's like the standard bearer for that optimism, Kingsmill Bond, as part of this episode, which you'll hear from shortly.
Yeah, which is great. And I gotta say, though, I kind of feel the opposite having now done all of these episodes. And just like the deeper in you go, the more you know how complicated it is
Right.
and how difficult it is to like slow this inertia that it is, how we've built civilization to function over the last 100 years. And and so now it's kind of like, how do we take this huge Titanic ship and try to turn it so it doesn't hit the iceberg?
Right.
And it feels impossible.
Yeah. And yet, if you look at, and I think what's so interesting is if you look at the data of how quickly renewable technologies are being deployed and you compare that with demand, and, AI data centers notwithstanding, this is a small fraction of total demand and projected demand, even in the largest cases. And it's totally dwarfed by the amount of solar capacity, for example, that's coming online every year. So it's like, I think it's really hard to think in terms of exponential trends and to wrap a human brain around what something that's changing exponentially actually feels like, Yeah. And it's when you have those processes in front of you is when you have these divergent views about what's happening. Because some people are stuck in like, well, this is the way things are. This is like the linear way that things evolve. And then other people who are looking at it from maybe a different perspective are seeing the exponential change, right? And they know that actually it's going to feel very, very different, much faster than you think, right? And this is like we've seen these kinds of technology these transitions before with, horse and buggy to automobile, or even electrification, like power stations, et cetera, like when these were just starting to crop up. Anyway, Kingsmill is quite fluent on these things, and you'll hear all this from him.
And now I would like to transition you to the recording of the live debate at Climate Week NYC. It was a part of RMI's Re-Energize the Conversation full day-long event. And this was a debate on the energy transition, looking at, is the energy transition going fast or slow? It features Kingsmill Bond from RMI and Aaron Denman from Bain, as well as Dina Cappiello and James Lawler, who are hosting it. Enjoy.
Our format today, what we're going to do is we're going to invite our speakers up momentarily, and they're each going to make some opening statements for about 6 minutes, and then we're going to flip to the other one so they'll have a chance to respond for a few minutes. And then we're going to go through, we think we'll have time for about 5 questions, and we'll go back and forth. Each speaker will have about 4 minutes to respond, and then the other will have 3 minutes to answer. And that will take us to the end of the hour, or just about the end of the hour. So without further ado, Dina, would you introduce our speakers today? And we'll get started.
And one note, which is really exciting that I forgot to say, James is actually going to convert this debate into a podcast on Climate Now. So it will actually be out there after this. So Kingsmill, behave yourself. Okay. With that, I am going to introduce both of our speakers. The first, obviously from RMI, is Kingsmill Bond. He is an energy analyst and economist in our strategy team. Kingsmill, come on up, and he is going to be debating, in quotes, so I think you're going to see there's a little bit more alignment than there is division. Aaron Denman. Aaron Denman is based in Chicago for Bain and Company, where he heads up the utilities and renewables practice in the Americas. We found actually Bain and Aaron because they do a survey every year of energy and natural resources executives about the pace of the transition. So what he will be presenting today is really the points of views at the people in the uppermost positions in many of the incumbent industries. So with that, we're going to start with Kingsmill, who's going to open up with his opening remarks.
Great, fantastic. Good morning, New York. So it's fun to be here. Thank you for the intro. We are here to talk about the speed of the energy transition. So it seems only right to start by recalling energy transitions led by this great city of New York. This is a history lesson. In 1882, Thomas Edison built the world's first commercial electric station in Pearl Street. It's about 3 miles from here. It provided electricity to 400 lights. It was powered by coal. It belched out toxic gases, broke down so frequently they had to keep engineers on site to keep it running. It was fiercely resisted by the immensely powerful and connected gas lighting industry, and the station broke down after only 8 years. And yet, this was the spark that lit the future. And millions of people have devoted their lives to make sure that the many barriers to change were solved. 140 years later, we live in a world utterly transformed by this innovation, with generation capacity today about 10 million times larger than it was when the first steam engines of Pearl Street were put into action. And so it is with the energy transition. Change is hard. Incumbents do their best to slow things down by promoting the story of slow change, which is reflected in Bain's excellent survey. Barriers are everywhere, and we need to innovate all the time to keep growing. But make no mistake, a door to a new world has been opened and by the collapse in the costs of clean tech, and we're in the middle of a shift from one system to another system. So let me start with the easy part of my assignment, growth. So it's undeniable that clean energy technologies are growing quickly. I'm quite interested to see the survey that people don't necessarily see there, but I'm going to lay out some of the facts of the case. So a decade ago, we generated about 800 terawatt hours a year from solar and wind. In 2023, we generated 5,000 terawatt hours. So there you go, five-fold increase in a decade. A decade ago, we sold 100,000 electric vehicles. Last year, we sold 14 million. So again, extraordinary growth has been taking place. And this is a revolution that is cascading around the world because, after all, everyone has sunshine and everyone wants cheap energy. So China hit, well, too much talk about China, but nevertheless, China hit its solar and wind 2030 goals in July 2024. Europe is pouring money into clean tech in an attempt to escape from the clutches of Russia. The US, of course, as we've heard, is speeding ahead with the IRA. But what may surprise you is that actually this is also going on in the global south. If I look at Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, the global south is only 5 years behind the United States in terms of the deployment of solar and wind as a share of their electricity system. They're growing at 25% a year. Pakistan, for example, has nearly doubled the size of its electricity system in 2 years by installing cheap Chinese solar panels. And to give you an insight into this, I'm going to quote from a Pakistani entrepreneur who makes footballs. He says, "Every bit of space I have, even if it is a few feet, I want it covered in solar panels. It's the only way we can beat our competitors in China and India." Now imagine that spirit repeated by millions of entrepreneurs in every single country around the world. In 2023, if I take global data from the IEA, solar panel sales, again, to give you a couple of stats, grew by 85%, wind turbine sales by 60%, battery storage tripled, and EV sales grew by 35%. Now, by any standards, that is spectacular growth that's going on out there. And that growth is now having a dramatic impact because the growth of the new first supplies all of the growth in demand, and then it pushes out the old. We have this peak, plateau, decline framing of change. There are, of course, therefore, red flags of peaking demand taking place right across the fossil fuel system. So the global market for combustion engines peaked in 2018 at over 80 million units. It's now below 60 million, just 6 years later, as they're substituted by electric vehicles. ICHLs in China, the world's largest car market, are in free fall, down in the last month where we have data by 20%, 23%. In electricity, in the US, fossil fuel demand for electricity peaked in 2007, folks. It's down by 13%. AI is not going to change that. The latest data show that we will install globally 600 gigawatts of solar this year. That's huge. It's enough to mean that peak fossil fuel demand for electricity generation quite clearly was 2023. That is the pivot moment in the pivot sector in the energy transition. So to look to the future, in technology transitions, the growth of new technology tends to follow its own logic. It's known to us wonks as an S-curve, which just means that growth keeps on going until you reach saturation. So this extremely rapid growth we have been seeing, we should expect to see it continue. Let me touch on the 3 reasons for this, and then I shall conclude. The first is technology itself. Clean tech technology just keeps getting better and cheaper. Solar panels get more efficient, batteries get denser. We're constantly figuring out new ways, as Amory will tell us, to improve efficiency and digitize energy. The second is energy security. Look around you. Renewables are everywhere. They're 100 times larger than fossil fuels. Once you put them up, they last for 30 years. 80% of people live in countries that import their fossil fuels, not like the United States. For most people in most countries, this is energy security. And the final reason why growth is going to carry on is justice itself. Because we need renewables to save millions, especially in poor communities, from pollution. We need renewables to bring energy to the energy-starved billions of the global south. And we need renewables to give a future to the unborn generations. So to conclude, we stand at a unique moment. For the first time in history, we have figured out how to harness and store the power of the sun directly and at low cost. We're seizing the moment, and we're going to carry on doing it. It'll make you richer, it'll make you more secure, it will give you clean air to breathe, and it will safeguard the planet. I urge you to reject the incumbent narrative of slow growth and support the motion that the energy transition is fast, inexorable, and now. Thank you.
Thanks, Kingsmill. So, Aaron, for our opposing perspective, please.
Well, first say thank you all. Thank you, James, Dina, Kingsmill, for the opportunity, and thank you for the participation. I think this dialogue of both sides is really important given the context we have. I will say, when you raised hands, I was surprised that I was going to be in the favorable position. But let me go through a bit of our research and why we did it. But before I get into some of the specifics, I want you to hear 2 themes, not just from my intro, but what I think will happen in this conversation. We think we're in a dual challenge. We have rising energy needs in a global population that's growing and becoming more prosperous. And at the same time, I think, as we all are saying, we need to dramatically reduce emissions. How do we meet rising energy demand while at the same time bending the curve on emissions? The second theme I hope you hear is sometimes phrased as optimist and pessimist, the cognitive dissonance that Dina mentioned. Let me phrase it as dreamers and doers. The dreamers who are envisioning what we can be and the solutions that we need to embrace. And the doers who are deep in the pragmatic changes of what needs to occur now, flagging the challenges that we must invent and overcome. So I want you to hear those 2 themes. As Kingsmill said, the energy transition has unleashed tremendous economic prosperity, technological advances, and lifted billions out of poverty. And this transition is going to be no different, but we do have that challenge. And in recognizing that challenge, a couple of years ago, what we undertook was, what are energy and natural resource companies feeling? What are they saying? And let's build a longitudinal view for how their perspective is evolving over time. Really focused on the pace of change, the role of energy transition businesses relative to their core business, what are the most attractive regions in the world to invest, and then what's the role of AI? And probably given your hands, you won't be surprised by some of the research we found this year, which is about 62% of companies, executives, believe that it's going to be 2060 or later from an energy transition standpoint. Now, this is 640-ish companies, 200 of the largest energy and natural resource companies in the world. So not just big, but many of the big ones and small, and covering 45 geographies. And you ask why 2060 or later, they're still committed to the energy transition businesses, but ROI challenges are real. Inflation, the cost of capital has increased, the growth around the world and geopolitical uncertainty. All those factors weighing in. So 62% say 2060 or later. If you compare that to last year, it was 54%. So the challenges they're facing now over the last 12 months are saying it's going to be later. Now, I'm sure we'll get into more specifics across different perspectives, but I want to come back to those two things. We are in a dual challenge. If you look at the data comparing energy consumption, so take the x-axis to CO2, it has been climbing in lockstep. We must meet rising energy demand and completely bend the curve backwards. And I think, like most of you in this room, we need the combination of doers and dreamers. The doers who are flagging the challenges we must overcome, and the dreamers who are inventing those solutions. We need both to make this transition happen.
Thank you. Kingsmill, I wonder if you could respond to that, and in particular, I think speak to this disconnect, at least that occurs to me between these rates of exponential growth, as you've described, which for anyone in the industry, these should be readily apparent. It should be fairly clear and tell a very hopeful story. And the results of a survey like the one that Aaron's group has conducted, which shows the opposite, namely a level of pessimism about the practicality of achieving the thing that we're actually seeing transpire. Like, I'm trying to understand that gap, and maybe you could address that.
And are you a dreamer?
First of all, I would like to start by thanking Aaron and his excellent team at Bain, not only for coming to the debate, but also for doing the tireless and vital work they did to do this analysis about how to drive change in the electricity system in the face, clearly, of very determined incumbent resistance to change, as documented by Leah Stokes or Michael Mann. And strictly speaking, it's not really a debate at all. We're both trying to get the best answer. And the good news there is that Bain is not alone. All over the world, there are countries and entrepreneurs and companies working night and day to find solutions. So no one individual can solve everything, not even Bain, not even their clients, actually. And that's why we have the market to solve these complex and difficult issues by pouring the talents of millions to solve them. There's even a rule for this called Orgel's second law. Essentially, the market is cleverer than you are. And all over the world, people are figuring out the solution. So then let me think a little bit about the survey. So one of the first things they teach you in analysis, obviously, and this is not new to anyone in this room, is to look at who is being surveyed. So here the clue I would suggest in the analysis is to look at the share of capital expenditure which these surveyed companies have going to clean tech, to new solutions. It's 24%, folks. This is the incumbency. So this is not a critique of Bain at all, because it's simply the people whom they talked to. They're talking to the incumbents, and they're talking to not to the insurgents. Well, guess what? In transitions, any transitions, it's not the incumbents who drive change. And what I'm talking about is laid out by, of course, Clay Christensen in his famous Innovator's Dilemma. It's encapsulated in Upton Sinclair's famous dictum that it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. That's what happens when you ask incumbents. Or the famous advice given to Henry Ford's lawyer in 1910, the horse is here to stay, but the automobile is just a novelty, a fad. That's what incumbents always think at times of rapid change. And at times of rapid change, perception moves more slowly than reality. They're moving on to this question, are we dreamers or doers? This is very insulting for us in RMI. RMI, we're all doers, except for me. I have the luxury, along with my great team, of actually doing a little bit of dreaming. But let me ask you, who are the dreamers in this energy system? Because what are we saying? We're making a very simple observation that there are a number of small modular technologies which are clearly enjoying learning curves, whereby they get cheaper every year, and are clearly following standard S-curves of deployment, whereby they get bigger every year. That's not dreaming, folks. That's just reality. In fact, the dreamers in this debate are the people who make highly optimistic forecasts about the future based on little evidence and a lot of hope. The true dreamers, or the true Pollyannas, are those who argue we can continue to pour pollution into the air and take it out one day in the future even though carbon capture technologies are expensive and have low learning curve. The dreamers are those who argue that humanity will stop innovating and our policymakers will prop up the fossil fuel system in spite of the pressure of billions to avoid climate catastrophe. The dreamers are those who hope that in spite of cheap, universal, clean energy, fossil fuel prices somehow can stay at levels just high enough to pay their bonuses. Those are the dreamers, folks. There are idealists and realists in this debate, and we are the database realists. Thank you.
Kingsmill, you obviously debated in high school or something. Okay.
Aaron, please, floor is yours. I think one question is, these companies, the ENR, energy and natural resource companies that were surveyed, are not, they have there's a lot of money that they're deploying into these fields, into these clean tech fields, and so they have formed views as to how rapidly these fields are growing. And they've had to do so looking at the same data that Kingsmill is looking at. So I'm curious to hear, your reflections on really the same question. Why is there this dissonance between the two views?
Yeah, no, and I appreciate all the facts that Kingsmill shared, and it's the combination of some historical data, and then we're at a cliff, and the net zero scenarios will magically take over, and we're there. I think this reality is how difficult some of these projects are. Just look at the announcements in the last 48 hours of 2 projects on clean hydrogen in Norway being canceled. And if you look at some of the challenges, right, we've done a lot around incentives. We've done a lot around supporting the build out of those hubs. The demand hasn't shown up. And we need the demand side to actually come and take place. That's one of the practical challenges that they're facing. Look, you want to say they have capital and skin in the game. They do. Do they want to make money? Yes. And would they love to make money on clean solutions too? Yes. There are some structural challenges that exist today. Let me give you one, because I know there's a lot of data on renewables in Kingsmill's research, which is fantastic. You should definitely take a read of it. There's a lot of amazing stuff in there. Building solar is actually relatively straightforward and simple. Doesn't take a long time to construct a solar field. The permitting process in the US right now, large data centers, which we see a lot of in the US, they want renewables. They cannot get, if you want a 500 megawatt data center site, they can't get renewables connected until 2028 or likely 2029. In Europe, onshore wind takes, in some member states, 9 years to get permitted. Ground-mounted solar takes 4 years. Even that is faster than the transmission to wheel the power. So if we need to wheel power from different locations, I'm not saying we won't do distributed in many ways. These are 10-year builds. And in many of the regulatory paradigms that exist, they say, I want certainty of that demand before I allow you to construct the transmission. We need to change those things. We won't build the transmission without the certainty of demand, and certainty of demand won't show up unless we have infrastructure to build it. And there are some of these dynamics that we're going to need to face. And it's not just incumbents saying certain things, but it's showing up actually in data. Of the CDP filers, 30% are well behind on scope 1 and scope 2. 50% are well behind on scope 3. In March of this year for SBTI, 29% of companies were removed from SBTI for non-compliance. We've done so much on renewables across the world. In China alone last year, we added 47.4 gigawatts of coal. It's not sufficient. We have to make a change. So there is tremendous progress, and there is no doubt, if you look at the facts of the data, that there's been a lot of solar development, a lot of wind development. But there are structural challenges that we must face if we're going to move even faster. It shows up in the data, not because they are holding it back, and you could argue that some might be. That's not for this conversation, or at least my position. But they're recognizing there are challenges to make the economics work, to build fast enough, and we have to go after those impediments to make this go faster.
Thank you for that. You talked about economic impediments, and I just the load growth thing is hanging out there. I'm going to come back to that. But I wanted to kind of shift a little bit to talk about politics. We're all sitting here weeks before a very pivotal US election, and ask you both how politics, not only in this country, and I'm not asking you to talk about the two candidates, all of us sitting here, we know it's a toss-up if you've read the latest polls, but how politics could affect, in your case, Kingsmill, the speed of transition, and how politics, in your case, Aaron, could affect the perspectives of these industries, right? There is a thought that we are already seeing some retrenchment from some of the incumbent industries because of a favorable political future for them. So who would like to go first with that question? I will take it to Aaron, as you've been starting. So maybe Aaron,
you want me to go first? Okay. Look, there will be an election. There will be a winner. And guess what? Technology will move forward. It's probably not what you thought I was going to say, but I think where we see incumbents from that question having challenges, and maybe it is hey, will this be more favorable, less favorable? It's actually uncertainty that creates significant challenges. When I don't know if the incentive that I'm banking on is going to be there for 20 years, am I going to put any more capital into those projects until some of that becomes more certain? And the IRA is unbelievably fantastic. Many will say it's too short. And given some changes, there are questions of how long those subsidies will remain. And even in some of the provisions, it's not yet clear what the rules actually are. So if you take green hydrogen as an example, one that we've done quite a bit of research on, there's many projects that are stalled because it's uncertain how those rules are going to truly play out. And so politics definitely has an impact. We see most of that impact now in its uncertainty of how it's going to land. Once we get more certainty, I think we'll see a greater uptick in that. But I will say, in all of that, don't bet against technology. We've had multiple presidencies in the US of different parties, and the march has occurred because of technological advances. And fracking before, but in solar. And if you look at the bipartisan support that's been there for ITC, PTC, over the generations of presidents, administrations, we continue to see that. So there will be politics, there are going to be issues, but I don't think we can count against technology change, despite, I think, the near-term uncertainty that exists.
Kingsmill?
So on politics, I'm sure you'd love to hear my views on the US political system, but I'm prevented from talking about that. Look, the energy transition, folks, it's a race. It's a race to the top. Who's going to win? So it's a kind of race for leadership of the energy and technology future, and therefore, without mentioning any countries by name, it follows logically that if the leaders of any one country decide to opt out of that race, that country is going to struggle to compete, because whilst you will certainly carry on growing, if you hamstring your athletes, they can't run as fast. And the classic example is from the Olympics. That'll be the second Olympics example of the day. So remember the 4x100 meters male relay. Like the US have got every single one of the top 4 athletes in the world. They're all super fast, but they managed to fluff the transition and they got disqualified and they're lost. And it's exactly the same in the energy transition. We all need to work at this together, and we need to have political leaders who help, not hinder, the change.
Thank you. Kingsmill, Aaron, I want to go back to getting into the practicalities and some of the details of this transition a little bit more deeply. So you've described a couple of large exponential trends, with solar deployment and renewable generation, EVs. But it seems, and maybe I'm wrong about this, and you could correct me, but it seems incorrect to paint the whole energy transition with this broad brush of fast learning rates that you see in solar. Because, for example, we generate electrons with solar. That's true. But in order to drive the processes that we depend on as society, in order to create goods, in order to manufacture steel, cement, etc., those technologies are much more difficult and challenging. So how do you think about the pace of transition when it comes to the use of energy and rather than generation and efficiency gains? Let's go to that third bucket.
Sure. So I mean, actually, as you say, there are basically three pieces to the energy transition. There's decarbonization of the electricity, there's electrification of everything else, and then there's AMRE, there's efficiency. Single-handedly, the third vector of the energy transition. Anyway, the point simply is, you're quite right. The first one is changing very fast. The second one is not changing at the moment in the United States. So electricity as a share of total final consumption in the US is the same roughly as it was 10 years ago. It's 22%. However, it is changing in most of the rest of the world. And this, I guess, is we're starting to solve the conundrum. It's one reason why people are more nervous in the US, but much more optimistic, dare I say, in China. China's come from electricity as a share of total final consumption a decade ago was like 15%. Now it's 25%. And they're absolutely on track for 30%. It just happens 1% per annum. So, and sorry, just to finish, in the Global South, it's a similar story. The Global South is racing to electrify. They're only actually about 5 percentage points behind the US right now. And again, if you look at Asia, about 20% of the Global South has overtaken the US, and it's very wide range of countries, from Brazil to Chile to Uruguay, but actually to Morocco and Egypt and Vietnam. You're getting this extremely quick electrification going on. So you're quite right. We by definition in strategy have to talk about the big picture, and of course I quite understand it's very, very difficult and it's very specific in each country. And if I make one final point, just to try and only came to me as we're kind of talking, then we have to realize there are three buckets inside the energy transition, right? So at the moment, 80% of the system is fossil fuels, 20% is non-fossils. And when you're trying to solve for the fossil system, there are three buckets of problems. There's 30% where, according to the IEA, we don't yet have the technical solution. Again, RMI, we've got folks trying to figure out that technical solution. There's about another 20% where we don't have the economic solution. We have to actually solve the economics. We heard about that in the previous panel. But, and that's all of these problem areas you hear so much about. But folks, there's 50% where we can do this thing, where we've got the technology, we've got the economics. The only barrier left is politics, and politics can be changed. So I think, yeah, it's complex, but it's also quite simple.
And so when you talk about the rest of the world being faster, you're principally talking about road transport and heating and cooling, or are there other things, or is that not right? Or
well, actually, the most exciting story is the electrification of light industries. It's one of, again, my colleagues are very bored about hearing me talking about this, but the electrification of light industry in China is an astonishing story. We heard about the panel earlier about how hard it is to electrify heavy industry, and that's definitely true. And I salute our industry team for the very hard, incredible work they're doing. But actually, low temperature heat in a whole swathe of sectors, like food production, for example, or shoes, or light manufacturing, that stuff is getting electrified at extraordinary speed in China. And that's incidentally why we had peak fossil fuel demand in China and globally in the industrial sector in 2014, because of the electrification of light industry in China.
So, Aaron, I wonder if this is maybe where some of the gap is occurring, because we're hearing about the accelerated rates of change in electricity generation. We're hearing about light industry. We're not necessarily hearing about sort of the heavy industrial type projects that traditional energy and natural resources companies invest in or are part of. And this is, I'm speaking outside of my comfort zone right now, so maybe I'm wrong about that. But I'm curious if maybe this is part of the difference here. It just, these companies don't play in the spaces that are seeing all of this change. Is that part of this?
I think it's part of the story. When you're in a emerging economy, and you can argue if China's still there, you're building new. And in many times when you're building new, you're thinking about what's the best choice that I have right in front of me now, and electrification is a big trend in that. In some parts of the developed world, it's incredibly challenging to be able to sort of convert what exists today into something in the future. I'll give you an example. Petchem facility in the southern part of Texas is deciding that they want to move from fossil assets to cogeneration. That cogeneration move is 400 megawatts. 400 megawatts. I'd love to do that with solar. Is there enough land nearby that facility? No. They're going to wheel that power from somewhere else, which requires additional transmission capacity because there's transmission constraints down in the southern part of Texas around Houston. And so they're like, what do I do in that solution, right? I'm going to drive as much energy efficiency as I can. Those are slam dunks from an ROI standpoint. Energy efficiency should be all over. But when you go from something that is an incumbent, but with structural challenges, right? Take the spaghetti that exists in the petchem facilities. To be able to electrify that has some enormous challenges to do that. And so that's the stuff they're struggling with. You can look at what Dow has done in the western part of Canada. Again, building new. We can think radically different about a new facility and how we construct that. If you look at the global south, one of the largest ports, or maybe it is the largest port in India, has built an entire industrial hub because as they built that out, they were being really thoughtful about how to interconnect all of those things. And then maybe one of the other challenges that I think underpins some of the difficulties if you take the US versus Europe. Electricity prices in Europe, and I will differ by member states, is 2 to 3x the price in the US. And natural gas prices are somewhere in the 4 to 5x what they are in the US. I think recently the price of Henry Hub in the US was under $2 an MMBTU, which is extraordinary. And so high prices create headroom to invest in some of those other technologies. And so when you look at the geographical differences, what's their starting point, what's available, what land or infrastructure challenges they have, what are the different prices, and what does that mean in terms of how fast they can move? Those are all things that make this challenge very difficult. Maybe I'll end with an example we often say in the US is the US alone has 50 energy transitions. We have a federal government, but we have state legislators who have different views on what that energy transition is going to look like. So even if you participate in the US, in many ways, you're navigating 50 different energy transitions. And so the local context matters a lot when we think about what solutions exist and how fast we can go.
Can I ask you one follow-up on that?
Of course.
I'm curious if to the degree that you've had direct interaction with these companies that participated in the survey, and if you ever ask, what would be, significant changes that would drive increased optimism towards this sector? Like what kinds of things, what's the answer to that? Like what would stimulate more capital, more enthusiasm?
Demand. I mean, it's the answer that they all say. And that's, I think, one of the really big challenges they have in West Texas today. And again, I'm using some US example because the price is so low. In West Texas, with excess renewable energy, you can create green hydrogen for about $1.50 a kg. Yeah. There are some, when you stack IRA credits, will say it's so cheap we could flare it. Now, you're not allowed per the rules, thank goodness. But some will argue it's so cheap you could flare hydrogen. You would think people would be lining up for that. But on the other side of that, they're saying, wait, I have existing infrastructure that I need to convert. You need me to pay for a 20-year offtake commitment so that I can meet that. I have, in many of the complexes that are gray today in the US, particularly West Texas where you'd want to use it, they need 24/7. Can you guarantee 24/7? Those are some of the challenges they're sort of working through. And so I think if we can get the demand side, you're going to see a lot of projects tip. And then I think the other thing, and this is not alone to the US, but you see this in Europe as well, we really need permitting reform. It takes so long to build anything. And for the stuff that's really hard, it takes way too long for us to build something. I mean, building a transmission line that takes 10 years, it doesn't technically take 10 years, but the entire process from when we need to construct it to when it's in the ground takes 10 years. It's extraordinary how long some of those things take. So those are two examples of, I think, if we could see some real demand side tick, I think you're going to see some of those projects accelerate. And then for large infrastructure, if we could see some permitting reform, again, US and in Europe, I think we're going to see faster growth.
Thank you for that. So many questions, but I know I've got 2 left, I believe. I want to get back to that third pillar, right? So we talked about decarbonization, we talked about electrification, and the third pillar being efficiency. And Amory's here, and I'm saying this as I'm going to try to channel him, which is very, very challenging. But we talked about demand, which is more, right? Not efficiency, which is less. When it comes to load growth and estimations of load growth, there are some believe that they're not factoring in efficiency gains and technologies over the course of that timeline. So do we really have to bend the curve this way? I'm going to turn it over to you, Kingsmill, first, because I want to kind of get your viewpoints from what your research and RMI research about where we are on efficiency and what has to be done, and maybe a viewpoint as well on this idea that we can only meet this load growth if we believe it's a valid, right, estimation with more, and some of that more is fossil fuels.
So, well, first of all, we all need to acknowledge that Amory in 1976 addressed this issue. And I don't know if you want to speak, Amory, but maybe after this debate, but he basically, if I may paraphrase, said that actually there's more efficiency coming through than you believe will happen, and therefore expectations of a rising demand are far too high. And he was right then, and he's still right. Efficiency gains still coming through at around 2 or 3% per annum. What's interesting, for what it's worth, is that global GDP growth is slowing, global population demand growth is slowing, and actually, and efficiency is rising. Actually, those two lines are going to cross in the 2030s, so there's not much room left for primary energy demand growth. But just to come on to this issue of load growth, because I know in the US, people are very excited about AI and the idea that AI might suddenly drive a huge surge in electricity demand. I mean, guys, I've got news for you. We've been hearing this story for 20 years. There's something called Coombs' law. Coombs' law basically says that every doubling basically says that every 18 months the energy required for processing halves. And they're just forgetting Coombs' law in that calculation. So AI will add to electricity demand, and it's going to add a few percent, but in the context of the giant US system, it's certainly not going to radically change the situation. And then final point, if I may make, about efficiency. And here I'm going to try and challenge the work by my brilliant colleague Dan Walter, who's in the room. So forgive me if I get it slightly a bit wrong. But anyway, the point to me is that we've got two types of final energy. It's like work type stuff, which is electricity, or technically in physics terms, electricity and transport, and your heat type stuff, which is heating stuff up. And we've got two inputs into that system to provide this energy. One is heat, which is burning stuff, and then the other is work, which is renewables. And the point to me is that we have now got the problem is that when you burn stuff, the physics of it means that inevitably you're losing 2/3 of your energy, and there's not a lot you can do about that. So we now have a situation where a century ago we basically had a heat-to-heat system. Now we've got half of our final energy demand is actually work, but we're still pouring heat with huge losses to generate that work. And folks, we don't need to do that anymore because we've got this wonderful thing called sun and wind. So what that means is therefore that we will undoubtedly reduce the amount of primary energy demand that we require over the next 10 or 20 years. And that just makes the entire energy transition dramatically easier. And this, incidentally, is why the kind of Exxon framing of rising population demand, rising wealth doesn't mean rising primary energy demand. Of course, it means rising useful energy demand. That's what happiness is. But it doesn't necessarily mean that primary energy demand will increase. And that just makes this entire energy transition much easier than people realize.
To what degree have you guys thought about how to increase the efficiency gains, year over year? Like 2 to 3%, is that what you said? So how does that number go higher?
Well, I'm not very scared with Amory in the room. There's two ways to increase efficiency. One is the easy way, which I focus on, which is simply that when you convert, just because of the mass of the situation, when you're getting your useful energy from solar rather than coal, you're getting, solar is basically 100% efficient and coal is only 33% efficient, or gas is only 40% efficient. So you get a 1% actually addition. So if efficiency gains have been averaging about 2%, they're going to average about 3% just from the maths of it. The other thing that we need to do is system design. As Amory says, we need to be massively improving the way we are actually using these end use technologies. And again, that's where it starts to get incredibly complicated, but there is huge opportunity to dramatically reduce the amount of energy that we get in order to get the heuristics we wish for.
Hey, James, do you mind if I respond?
Yeah, please.
So take data centers, which I understand the point of the law. Take the average data center that was being built as of 2 to 3 years ago, roughly 10 to 20 megawatts. Data centers, the hyperscalers building models right now are starting at 500 gigawatts or 500 megawatts. We know from our work that some of those demands are in the range of 2 to 5 gigawatts per data center. So what we have around AI is a national security sovereignty issue, where you have leaders in LLMs who say we must lead this race to the point about technology innovation, and you are seeing a rapid growth in AI and the data center demand from that. It also means that when you see the efficiency from data centers, and there was clearly there, so if you look at load growth in some of the developed markets, there was clearly a lot of data centers being built, but the efficiencies within those data centers offset that. What we're seeing is such a massive amount of data center demand that efficiency is not going to eat that away over the near term. That's why you see coal plants being extended. That's why you see gas plants that were going to be retired being put back on. That's why you see 3 Mile Island being restarted. Palisades, we've looked at the list. You might see more reactors come under consideration. Now look, the hyperscalers have a long-term commitment and they're not backing away from that. So what we're hearing, what we're seeing, what you should think about is what happens over the short term and what happens over the long term. It is hard for me to believe that you won't see an increase, a significant increase in load over the short run. Perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps these things will fail and we're running scenarios on that. But the load growth is extraordinary. E.ON in Germany says that their queue, which already has signed up, is 6 gigawatts. For those of you who are in Germany, I don't remember the exact number of stats the CEO said, but it's like as large as 3 or 4 cities in Germany combined. And so we are talking about really large load. For the energy transition, you can take chip manufacturing, you can take battery manufacturing, a lot of that what's happening in the US. There's one in upstate New York, which is entirely bigger than many of the cities that are up there. It's so big, it's actually more energy consumption than the entire state of Vermont. Vermont's not a huge state, but by comparison, it tells you that it's really extraordinary. So we have to figure out how we meet this need in the near term as clean as we can, but not lock into long-term commitments, which make our energy transition even more challenging.
So, Kingsmill, I'm wondering if you could sort of, and if I don't mean to put you too much on the spot here, but you seem like someone who might know the answer to this off the top of your head. Compare kind of the load growth scenarios that we just heard from Aaron with the amount of renewables projects that are in the queue today, like that could come online if they could get permitted, if that essentially projects that are planned, which could come online, just to square those two for us, are we really, is the problem that we cannot build enough renewables and hence we have to do these other things, or that it's some legislation sort of process change which then unlocks everything Aaron just said plus maybe a bunch of other things? Like how should we make sense of that?
So this is one of those happy moments where we can actually rely on the data. So there's these very large numbers, and Aaron is completely right, and I salute you, they're very big numbers, but they need to be put in context of a very, very big system. So if you take the International Energy Agency data, and again, it's all very publicly available, you can see the chart, data centers currently, and AI currently using about 400 terawatt hours in a 30,000 terawatt hour system globally. That's in fact the case. The expectation under their most aggressive scenario is that by the end of this decade, it would be 1,000 terawatt hours. So that's 600 increase in about 6 years. So it's about 100 terawatt hours a year. It's a huge amount of energy, 100 terawatt hours a year. Global electricity demand grows around 3% a year, which is 900 terawatt hours a year, 30,000 terawatt system. Solar supply growth globally this year will be, as I say, 600 gigawatts, about 700 terawatt hours. So to put this in context, the entire global increase in data center demand will be met by 2 months of new solar. So it's giant, but solar is even more giant. And therein, I guess, lies the point. So again, Aaron's completely right that in individual locations, such as, I myself come from Ireland, and Ireland's a real issue because there's just huge data centers in Ireland, and it's a real problem. In individual states and locations, it is a real problem. But to use that as some unscrupulous utilities are seeking to do, to open up coal plants and gas plants, is simply the wrong thing to do in 2024. There are far better solutions.
I mean, wouldn't they be doing that because that's the cheapest thing for them to do? Like,
what?
No. It's not the cheapest thing to do. It is we need to keep the system reliable. That's why they're doing it. Look, wind and solar are cheaper. It is. It is. But the system has to remain reliable. The averages are terrific. Really large numbers, you wash themselves out. What happens is a 500 megawatt data center or a gigawatt data center, it drops. You can build the solar somewhere else, but we need to be able to wheel that power to that site. So the issue is not necessarily how much renewables are in the interconnection queues. It's a lot. There's a lot of gunk. We can a long debate around what we do around interconnection queues. The challenge with data centers is not that in aggregate it's small relative to large. It's that when those data centers show up, they're extremely large, and there is massive transmission capacity issues that we're going to need to face. And that isn't just a US issue. You see it in other parts of the world. But that's where it's not a macro issue. It is a very local issue that has to be solved. And those who are sitting on it are saying, look, I have constituents, I have customers, all of you, that I want to make sure have reliable, safe, affordable power. And I now have to interconnect in a 500 megawatt data center. How do I do that to make sure that when there is extreme heat or whatever, that's reliable? And it takes so long to get transmission capacity. You're seeing choices being made, which we know from many of those conversations they do not like to have to make.
Thanks, Aaron. So final question here. I'd love to hear from both of you guys on this. I'll start with you, Kingsmill. So we've talked about a lot of technologies. One that we haven't really talked about is batteries. And I know RMI has done a lot of work with microgrids and testing these things. And just speaking to the point, to the scenario that Aaron mentioned, how far away are we from generation and storage solutions, powering data centers locally, or nearby, so that you wouldn't have to extend the life of a fossil plant, for example?
Okay, I mean, we need to be a little bit beyond this data center argument. It's
Sure.
It's not the only debate in the energy system, with all due respect. But look, let's talk about batteries. Right. So, again, with batteries, we have this extraordinary story going on. I guess we should have talked a little bit more about it. But I mean, the batteries again are growing at 30% a year. Storage batteries tripled last year. They're going to double again this year. So you have this incredible growth story going on in batteries. And there's this kind of long-standing concern that we don't have enough minerals. Again, my colleagues, Dan and Sam, on the back here, did a very brilliant piece of analysis which demonstrated that actually when you improve chemistries and you recycle, you're not going to need huge amounts of new minerals. And in fact, you're going to have peak mineral demand for batteries in the 2030s already. So batteries is another unsung hero of the energy transition, which will make possible this type of growth. And increasingly now, again, as folks here know, developers, when they're building systems all over the world, they're putting batteries in. So you're actually getting 24-hour solar effectively because you've got batteries with it. So it does absolutely change the dynamics of what is possible. And I think this, again, makes the wider observation, what I made earlier about Orgel's second rule. We cannot possibly forecast in detail how every single new innovation will work, but there are just innovations coming through all the time. And again, the folks in Bain doing a great job to commercialize and get these innovations out as quickly as possible. Of course, there are specific instances where it can't be done. You might need a bit of coal or gas, or the Dunkelflaute that the Germans talk about. That's absolutely fine, but it's not going to stop the wider change that's going on.
Aaron, your response and final remarks?
I wouldn't bet against technology. I think batteries are going to have a really important role. We wrote something probably a decade ago now on the holy grail of the energy system, and batteries was one of those. I will say we're going to need long duration storage. We're sitting here in New York. If you were to take the winter peak, and I'll get the data exactly, I won't get it perfect, but the winter peak is likely going to be something in order of 2 to 3x what the summer peak is. And so when we think about the amount of energy in a city like New York, the current technology, the current duration, as much as we can do around that is obviously going to be important. But to solve something that dramatic, we are going to need to see a growth in longer duration storage as an alternative to just lithium ion that's used today.
Great.
Any final thoughts, Kingsmill?
Well, this is a happy moment. We're totally in agreement. I think, look, it's very clear there are endgame problems everywhere, and winter demand is definitely one of them. So it is true that we don't, in 2024, have solutions for the last 10 or 20% of the fossil fuel system. But our story is about disruption to a system which is 80%. So again, I'm a simple finance guy, but if you're selling widgets and you're selling 80 today, and in 30 years' time you're going to sell 20, that's not a great business position to be in. So I think it's important to realize that this fossil fuel industry is on the cusp of disruption as a result of this new stuff coming into the system.
So with that final vote here. Oh.
Yeah, I'll go.
Okay. Show of hands. Who thinks it's going faster than they thought when they came into this room? Let's ask that question. Oh, all right. Some differences there. Dina?
Just wanted to thank everybody for coming. This concludes our program for It's Time to Re-Energize, our first ever all-day event at Climate Week. I would love if before everybody kind of gets up and socializes to just join me for a round of applause for the many RMI teams that put this together.
That's all for this episode of the Climate Now podcast. We hope you'll join us for season 2.